David Kent. Did you recognize that young lady? Well, probably not. That was Lizzie Borden. Not at all the grotesque monster that she's often portrayed to be. For the past 3 years, I've been researching and writing 2 books and a play about her. For 100 years, children have been skipping rope and chanting that jingle about her you just heard. Everybody knows Lizzie Borden's name. It's as familiar as Alexander Graham Bell or Babe Ruth or Rudolph Valentino. Supposedly, as the jingle says, she killed her mother and father with an axe 100 years ago. Well, maybe she did, and maybe she didn't. But even if she did, what has made the Borden murders the most celebrated, the most investigated mystery in the annals of American crime? The Borden murders, whoever committed them, are to the United States what the Jack the Ripper murders are to England. Today we have serial killers who slaughter people by the dozens, and 2 months later we can't even tell you what their names were. So why do psychiatrists and psychologists, journalists and jurists still continue to study this case? It's not the murders that are commemorated, but the eternal mystery of what could possibly have happened that August morning in Fall River, Massachusetts. To this day, no one can say. Anyone who says Lizzie is guilty or not guilty just hasn't studied the facts. A casual or a prejudiced look at the evidence will indicate she probably did kill Andrew and Abby Borden, but a closer look at the same evidence may suggest to you that she couldn't possibly have. It even raises the question of whether anyone could have killed her. But of course, we know somebody did. It's the proverbial mystery wrapped in an enigma inside a puzzle. But how can such an incongruity still exist after 100 years? Well, let's see if we can find out.
Sullivan, editor of the Fall River Herald News, and like many of the people who will be visiting the city during the centennial of the infamous murders, someone who is fascinated with the legend of Lizzie Borden. Here at 92 2nd Street, since renumbered 230, is a house where Lizzie Borden lived and where her father Andrew J. Borden and stepmother Abby Borden were found brutally murdered on a sultry summer morning in 1892, exactly 100 years ago, this August 4th. Andrew Jackson Borden was descended from a pretty long line of upright, self-made Yankees. In fact, most of the Borden lineage was single-handedly responsible for either founding the city of Fall River, owning and maintaining large sections of it, or both. Unlike some of the members of the Borden clan, men like Colonel Richard Borden, who played a major role in developing the city into a prominent mill town, Andrew was a lesser Borden who didn't inherit his wealth, but earned it through hard work and economy. Andrew was the epitome of the self-made man and quickly earned a reputation as a skinflint. In 1844, while only 22 years old, he formed a partnership with William M. Almy, dealing in furniture and feathers. Andrew wisely invested his substantial earnings in real estate. Many of the city's thriving mills, including the Globe Yarn Mills, the Troy Cotton and Woolen Manufactory, and the Merchants Manufacturing Company. By the time of his death in 1892, Andrew Borden had ascended to the rank of president and director of the Union Savings Bank, director of the BMC Durfee Safe Deposit Company. He also owns stock in the Globe Street Railway Company and a good chunk of real estate in Fall River and nearby Swansea. At the time of his death, despite not being fortunate enough to have inherited the wealth and austerity which went along with his family name, Andrew Borden was worth nearly $500,000. Whatever magic touch Andrew Borden had in his business dealings, he sure didn't have the same with his domestic affairs. On March 26, 1863, his wife of 18 years, Sarah A. Morse, pictured here with baby Emma, passed away. Just 5 years after the couple's second child, Alice Esther, died at the tender age of 2. With her mother gone, Emma Lenora Borden, then only 12, took her role as big sister literally. She began tending to the house and her younger sister, Lizzie. Not much is known of Lizzie Borden's early childhood, but it is widely believed that she was both rambunctious and spoiled, traits not uncommon for the youngest child in any family. Though Emma was capable of handling many of the chores around the house, and Mr. Borden continued to keep a maid, he was cut from old cloth, and he took on a second wife only 2 years after Sarah's death. Abby Durfee Gray became Abby Durfee Gray Borden on June 6, 1865. Abby was a drab-looking woman whose most appealing qualities were probably her subservient nature and meticulous domestic abilities. There is little to suggest their marriage was rooted in romance. This is the family that resided resided at 92 2nd Street in 1892. Andrew, Abby, Emma, and Lizzie, together with an Irish domestic servant, Bridget Sullivan, who was called Maggie by the Borden sisters. They were all cramped inside a small, one-family house in the heart of downtown Fall River.
I'd have to say that it was certainly a very unhappy and tension-filled home. The daughters, Emma and Lizzie, rarely, if ever, came down for meals with their parents. Lizzie spoke to her stepmother, Abby, only when she was spoken to. At her inquest, Lizzie Borden says that she had a cordial relationship with her stepmother, but then she says it depends on one's idea of cordiality.
The former two-family dwelling was converted into a one-family home and modestly furnished. This was unsuitable to a woman of Lizzie Borden's standards. Unlike her father, she was concerned with maintaining the character and prestige of her family name and thought they deserved to live on the hill. There was a great deal of unrest within the Borden family by the early 1890s. Many of the domestic quarrels over money and social status can be traced to a real estate deal that Mr. Borden made some 5 years before his death with help from another curious character in the Borden saga. John Vinicum Morse was the brother of Mr. Borden's first wife, Sarah, and he was the closest thing to a friend that Andrew could claim. Both shared an avid interest in real estate and finances. Uncle John also played an interesting role in the murders, as he was a house guest at the time. With John Morse's help, Andrew bought a half share of a house owned by Abby's sister, Mrs. Sarah Whitehead. And he put it in Abby's name, more or less in an effort to bail out his financially strapped sister-in-law. The deal was made clandestinely, but once word reached Emma and Lizzie, the Cold War that would last for the next 5 years began. From that point on, jaded with the thought of their father's betrayal at the urging of Abby and the help of Uncle John, the Borden sisters made their displeasure known in overt ways. Lizzie ceased calling Abby mother and spoke to and of her only as Mrs. Borden. Emma and Lizzie also ate with their parents only when it was necessary. Andrew, in a last-ditch effort to mend his broken family, tried to make up for his error by splitting the old Furry Street cottage into a double rental and giving half to each daughter. But neither Lizzie nor Emma were appeased, and Andrew bought the property back from them at a higher price a short time later.
Obviously, there was a great deal of hostility and resentment. Lizzie and Emma felt that Abby had somehow put Andrew up to this, that she was somehow a greedy person going after Andrew's wealth, and they demanded of their father that they be treated equally.
The big money factor is there, and one of the important aspects of that is that they had money, but they didn't spend it. In the late 1890s, most houses, especially a family with an income like theirs, and he was worth $500,000 when he died, those days houses did have electricity, they didn't. They had bathtubs, they didn't. They had running water, they didn't. They usually had telephones, and they didn't. And basically, Lizzie, above all, wanted to live as well as the Bordens who lived up on the hill lived. And surprisingly, however, the brutal slaughter which would forever put Fall River on the map was not the first
place in June of 1891. Both Andrew and Abby had gone on a rare excursion together to Mr. Borden's Swansea farm at the time, leaving Lizzie, Emma, and Bridget on the premises. The presumption was that someone broke into this house, and that they then made off with a small amount of jewelry, approximately $40 worth, from a desk drawer, and some railway tickets. Oddly enough, the Borden servant, Bridget Sullivan, who would have been the prime suspect in such a robbery, was not dismissed after the incident. And like the murders, the crime remained unsolved. After this, Mr. Borden made a habit of keeping his bedroom door locked and placing the key prominently on the fireplace mantel in clear view of all household occupants. The only other household member to take up this practice was Lizzie. So these were the circumstances leading to the summer of 1892 and that wicked hot August morning when Andrew and Abby were slain at the hands of a murderer brandishing a hatchet.
The first to awaken on the morning of August 4th was the Irish maid, Bridget Sullivan.
I got up at 6:15, brought up some wood, started my fire, and went down to get some coal. Mrs. Borden came downstairs from her bedroom and went into the sitting room. Mr. Borden next appeared down the back stairway from his bedroom. I only saw Mr. and Mrs. Borden until I put down the breakfast on the table, and Mr. Morse sat down to breakfast. There was some mutton, some broth, Johnny cakes, coffee, and cookies. It might have been 7:15.
The absence of the Borden sisters at the breakfast table was not uncommon. Emma, however, had a better excuse than Lizzie for not joining them. She had ventured to visit her friends, the Brownells, in nearby Fairhaven. Reading many studies of the case, it's difficult to understand how very small the house was. Suffice to say that little could occur within these walls without other occupants knowing it. In other words, it would have been easy for someone to listen in until breakfast was finished before coming downstairs. Bridget Sullivan continued to reconstruct the sequence of events that morning during her trial testimony.
I was washing dishes at the sink, and Miss Lizzie came through the kitchen and she left down the slop pail. And I asked her what did she want for breakfast. She said she didn't know as she wanted any breakfast, but she guessed she would have something. She would have coffee and cookies. I went out in the backyard, and she was getting her own breakfast. I had a sick headache, and I was sick to my stomach. I went out to vomit in the backyard.
Shortly after breakfast and the morning amenities, John Morse left to visit relatives in the city. He was followed soon after by Mr. Borden, who commenced his morning ritual of visiting downtown properties and bank interests. According to Bridget, it was then that Mrs. Borden told her to wash the windows.
Mrs. Borden was in the dining room, and she asked me if I had anything to do this morning. I said no, not particular. She said she wanted the windows washed. I asked her how, and she said inside and outside both. They're awful dirty. I didn't see her anymore until I found her dead upstairs.
According to Bridget at the trial and Lizzie at the inquest, Mrs. Borden went upstairs to clean a guest room, much like this one, where Uncle John had spent the previous night. Lizzie claimed her stepmother said she was going to change the pillowcases.
The Borden house was also distinctive in that it boasted no hallways or corridors. You literally had to walk through one room to get to another. And with locked doors and furniture blocking the way from Mr. and Mrs. Borden's room, the only access to the second floor guest room was through the front stairway.
Mrs. Borden had been doing the downstairs dusting. This was a ritual which would have eventually led her to the front part of the second floor and the guest room. She was doing this because Bridget, the maid, was not responsible for any bedroom other than her own. Medical evidence introduced at the trial concluded that Abby Borden was killed sometime around 9:40 a.m. Dr. Seabury Bowen, a friend and neighbor of the Bordens, was the first physician on the scene.
I went directly up the front stairs and stopped by the front chamber. At that point, I looked over and saw the prostrate form of Mrs. Borden. I went to the back of the bed and placed my hands on her head. I found there were wounds in the head, felt for a pulse, that is, felt of her wrist, and found she was dead.
Abby Durfee Borden had sustained 19 wounds about the head and neck. Bridget testified that she was outside washing windows at the time. Lizzie said at the inquest that she was in the house.
Everybody had been told her stepmother had received a note and had gone out to visit a sick friend. So nobody ever looked for Mrs. Borden because they understood she'd gone out. And people think that Lizzie did really think that she'd gone out to sign that will.
The Harvard Medical School determined that she died roughly around 9:30 in the morning. They can't be deadly accurate, but that's the number that most people agree on. She was killed first, and Andrew was killed approximately an hour and a half later, around 11 o'clock.
Mr. Borden came in and asked for Abby. Lizzie replied that she had received a note to see someone who was sick. So after going about business upstairs, Andrew stretched out on the sitting room couch to take a nap. He would never leave that room alive. Around 10:40, Bridget Sullivan was washing the interior windows in the sitting room when she heard someone fumbling at the front door.
I heard like a person was trying to unlock the door and push it but could not. So I went to the front door and unlocked it. As I unlocked her, I said, "Oh, pshaw." And Miss Lizzie laughed upstairs. My father was out there on the doorstep. She was upstairs, either in the entry or at the top of the stairs.
Just shortly after 11, Bridget heard Miss Lizzie calling from downstairs.
Maggie, come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody's coming and killed him.
I went into the sitting room and saw the form of Mr. Borden lying on the sofa. His face was very badly cut with apparently a sharp instrument. There was blood all over his face. I felt for his pulse and satisfied myself that he was dead.
Even when the first doctors arrived on the scene, they noticed that his blood was very fresh and still flowing, and that her blood had congealed, and obviously she had been dead for what they thought at the time a couple of hours earlier. They weren't far off, about half an hour off.
Of course, the first to latch onto the news were local journalists. Headlines boasted shocking crime, a venerable citizen and his aged wife hacked to pieces in their home.